There is a region in northeastern Brazil that most people outside the country have never heard of, and that most people inside the country have heard of primarily through the language of absence, the absence of rain, the absence of rivers that run year round, the absence of the green that other parts of Brazil take for granted, that other parts of the world associate with life itself. The region is called the Sertão, and it covers an area roughly the size of Western Europe, stretching across 9 states in a landscape that shifts between dry scrubland and cracked earth and the particular gray brown of vegetation that has learned, over millions of years of adaptation, to survive on almost nothing. The people who have lived in the Sertão for generations have learned the same thing. Not from biology, not from millions of years of slow adaptation, but from necessity. From the specific, immediate, uncompromising necessity of living in a place where the rain can disappear for years at a time, where the ground hardens into something closer to concrete than soil, where the animals leave or die, where the crops fail completely, and where the question of what to eat stops being a matter of preference and becomes a matter of whether you will be alive next week. What they ate in those times is the subject of this story, not what they ate when things were difficult, what they ate when things were at the absolute limit of what human beings can endure and still endure, what they ate during the great droughts, the secas, as they are called in Portuguese, that recur through the history of the Sertão with a regularity that is almost geological, each one reshaping the population and the landscape in ways that take decades to recover from. What they ate is not a story about poverty in the sense that the word is usually used. It is a story about knowledge, about a relationship with a landscape so intimate and so hard won that it produced a form of nutritional intelligence that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. The people of the Sertão did not simply survive the droughts. In the worst of them, in the periods when everything that could be exhausted had been exhausted, they survived on things that the rest of the world would not have recognized as food at all. And the knowledge of how to do that, the specific, detailed, experiential knowledge of which root to dig and how deep, which cactus to cut and how to prepare it, which insects were safe and which were not, which parts of which animals contained enough nutrition to justify the energy of catching them. That knowledge was passed from generation to generation with the same seriousness and the same care
I
as
remember the
any other
dust on the
form of
road
inheritance.
and the way the light hits
Because
the
in the
fields in the
Sertão,
morning.
it was inheritance in the
It
most
feels like
literal
yesterday.
sense. It was what kept the family line alive. The drought that most people who study the Sertão use as a reference point is the drought of 1877 to 1879, known in Brazilian historical memory as the Grande Seca, the Great Drought. By the time it ended, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people had died. Estimates vary, and the uncertainty in the numbers itself tells you something about the conditions under which people were living and dying. Conditions that did not always produce the kind of documentation that allows for precise accounting afterward. People died of starvation. People died of the diseases that follow starvation, that find bodies whose immune systems have been depleted by months of insufficient nutrition and overwhelm them with infections that a well fed body would have managed easily. People died on the roads, walking toward the coast, toward the cities, toward anywhere that was rumored to have water and food, dying in transit before they reached it. The landscape of the Sertão in those years was described by observers who passed through it in terms that sound like descriptions of a different planet. A gray and silent world of dead vegetation and bleached animal bones crossed by columns of people who had already consumed everything available within reach of where they lived and were moving toward the possibility of something further away. The people who did not die, who stayed, who found ways to extract nutrition from a landscape that appeared to have nothing left to give. did so through the application of a knowledge system that had been built up over generations of living with drought. Not every drought produced conditions as extreme as 1877. There were smaller droughts, partial droughts, years of reduced rainfall that required adjustment, rather than the absolute survival calculus of the worst events. In those smaller droughts, the knowledge was tested and refined and added to. Each generation that survived a hard period passed on what had worked, added what they had learned, corrected what had not, held up under the pressure of real scarcity. By the time the Grande Seca
See
arrived,
these
the people of the
leaves.
Sertão carried
They are
inside them a
essential
nutritional
for
map of their
treating
landscape
infections.
that was
And the bark,
extraordinarily
is it
detailed
used
and
as well?
extraordinarily practical. It was not always enough. In 1877, nothing was enough, but it kept more people alive than would have survived without it. The first and most important element of that knowledge was the umbuzeiro, the tree whose name, in the indigenous Tupi language from which Portuguese borrowed it, means something close to the tree that gives water. The umbuzeiro is a native tree of the Sertão that has evolved a remarkable adaptation to drought conditions. It stores water and nutrients in a system of enlarged roots that can extend deep into the soil. Roots that are technically classified as xylopodia, thickened underground storage organs that the tree uses to survive extended dry periods. During a drought, when the above ground vegetation has long since died back and the landscape is brown and cracked and apparently lifeless, the umbuzeiro's roots remain full of a fluid that is part water and part nutrition, a substance that the people of the Sertão learned to extract, consume, and use as a basis for survival when nothing else was available. The process of using the umbuzeiro during extreme drought was not simply a matter of digging up the roots and eating them. It required specific knowledge of where the trees grew, which roots were worth harvesting, how to extract the fluid without damaging the tree's capacity to regenerate when the rains eventually returned, and how to process what was harvested into forms that could sustain a family over days and weeks rather than providing a single meal. The roots could be eaten raw, and during the worst periods they were, because the energy required to process them was itself a resource that had to be conserved. But the preferred preparation involved extraction of the fluid in combination with whatever else might be available. A small amount of farinha, the dried cassava flour that is the staple of the northeastern diet when anything at all is available, or the fruit of the umbuzeiro itself during the brief periods when it bore fruit, or simply consumed as a liquid when nothing else was at hand. Families who owned land with umbuzeiro trees on it were meaningfully better positioned to survive drought than families who did not, and the location of umbuzeiro trees was information that was held and passed on with the seriousness of property. The umbu fruit itself, the small greenish-yellow fruit that the umbuzeiro produces during its brief productive period, was consumed in every possible form. Fresh, when fresh was available. Dried, when there had been time to prepare for the dry period. Fermented, because fermentation was a way of extending the usable life of food that would otherwise spoil, and because the fermented product, called umbuzada in various forms, provided calories and fluid in a form that could be preserved, the systematic preservation of umbu fruit before a drought, the drying and storing and fermenting of as much as possible during the years of adequate rainfall was one of the practices that distinguished families who survived droughts
You must
consistently
check
from
the
those who did not.
consistency daily. When
The
it is
knowledge of
soft
how to
but
do it,
firm,
when
it
to
is
do
ready
it,
for the
and
clay
how much
pot.
was enough was part of the inheritance. The xique-xique is a cactus native to the Sertão that looks, to anyone who has not grown up with it, like an impenetrable barrier of spines rather than a source of food and water. It grows in dense clusters, its cylindrical segments covered in white spines that make handling it without preparation essentially impossible. During drought, when surface water has disappeared and the soil is too dry to yield anything from conventional digging, the xique-xique became a primary source of fluid for both humans and animals. The preparation required knowledge and effort. The spines had to be removed. burned off using fire, a technique that required careful management to avoid destroying the moisture-containing tissue underneath. The burned and cleaned segments were then cut open in the interior. A fibrous pulp with significant water content was accessible for consumption. The pulp itself was edible, and the liquid that could be pressed from it was drinkable, though the taste was not something that anyone who had an alternative would have chosen. But during the worst periods of drought, when the alternative to the xique-xique's fluid was no fluid at all, the taste was irrelevant. The xique-xique was also used as fodder for cattle and goats during drought. The same burning and cutting technique applied to feed livestock that would otherwise have died. A farmer who knew how to keep his animals alive through a drought on xique-xique had something to rebuild with when the rains came. A farmer whose animals all died had nothing. The knowledge of xique-xique preparation was therefore not just nutritional knowledge in the sense of what a person could eat. It was agricultural knowledge in the sense of what an entire family economy could survive on. The men who spent the worst weeks of a drought cutting and burning cactus to feed animals that were barely alive were doing something that looked, from outside the situation, like desperate improvisation. From inside the situation, it was the application of specific inherited knowledge to an emergency that the knowledge had been developed precisely to address. The jurema is a thorny shrub that grows widely across the Sertão, and that has been part of the region's nutritional and medicinal landscape for as long as the region has been inhabited. During drought, the jurema's role shifted from its more ordinary uses to something more fundamental. The bark and roots of certain jurema varieties contain compounds that have mild analgesic and sedative properties. Properties that have been used in indigenous ceremonial contexts for centuries, and that in the context of drought and starvation served a different, but related function. The jurema did not provide significant caloric nutrition. What it provided was relief from the specific agony of extended hunger, the ability to suppress, at least partially and temporarily, the pain signals that a body produces when it has been without adequate food for an extended period. People who had nothing to eat used jurema preparations not to nourish themselves, but to make the experience of not eating more survivable. The distinction between nourishment and the management of suffering is one that becomes very clear in conditions of extreme scarcity. And the jurema occupied a specific and important place in the Sertão's drought survival toolkit precisely because it addressed the suffering rather than the scarcity. The consumption of insects during drought in the Sertão was not a last resort in the sense of something people did only when everything else had failed. It was part of a nutritional repertoire that included insects as a known and usable resource, one that required specific knowledge of which species were safe, how to harvest them, and how to prepare them in ways that maximized their nutritional value. Termites were the most commonly documented insect food source. They are present in enormous quantities in the Sertão landscape. Their mounds visible across the scrubland, and they represent a concentrated source of protein and fat in a landscape where protein and fat from conventional animal sources had disappeared. The harvesting of termites required approaching the mounds in ways that minimized the defensive response of the colony, and the preparation of termites for consumption varied from roasting directly on coals to grinding into a paste that could be mixed with other available substances to create something more closely resembling a conventional food than the insects in their raw form. Beetles, larvae, and other insects were consumed as conditions required, and the knowledge of which insects were nutritionally valuable and which were not, which were dangerous and which were safe, was specific enough that the people who possessed it could make genuine distinctions within the insect population of the Sertão rather than simply consuming anything that moved. This specificity is important because it demonstrates that the insect consumption of the Sertão during drought was not the product of complete desperation eliminating all discrimination. It was the product of knowledge. knowledge that had been accumulated through experience and passed down through generations as part of the broader nutritional intelligence of the landscape. The hunting of wild animals during drought presented a paradox that the people of the Sertão understood well. The same conditions that made hunting necessary, the disappearance of domestic animals and cultivated food sources, also made hunting difficult because wild animals responded to drought by moving, dying, or retreating to whatever pockets of water and vegetation remained. The animals that stayed or that could be found were often in poor condition, thin, weakened, nutritionally less valuable than healthy animals would have been. But they were present, and the knowledge of where to find them and how to take them was part of the drought survival knowledge of the Sertão in ways that went well beyond ordinary hunting skill. The armadillo, called tatu in Portuguese, was one of the most important drought period food sources in the Sertão. It is a burrowing animal that can survive in conditions that kill most other wildlife, and its meat, while not nutritionally exceptional, provided protein during periods when protein from any source was more important than it ever is in ordinary times. The technique for finding and capturing armadillos during drought was specific and detailed. Knowledge of which types of soil they preferred for burrowing, how to identify the signs of their presence, how to dig them out without exhausting more energy than the animal's meat would replace. The lizard called the tu, a large ground-dwelling reptile that is widespread in the Sertão, was another critical drought period food source. Large enough to provide meaningful meat, tough enough to survive conditions that eliminated less resilient species, the tu was hunted during drought with a persistence that its ordinary status as food. It was consumed in ordinary times as well, but with less urgency, did not fully reflect. The preparation of tu meat was a specialized skill, and the parts of the animal considered most valuable differed from the parts that would be prioritized in a well-fed condition. The fat deposits that tus accumulate as an adaptation to periods of scarcity were specifically sought during drought, because fat was the nutritional component most difficult to obtain from any other source in the drought period Sertão landscape, and the body's need for it, after weeks or months of lean protein and plant materials, was something that the people of the Sertão understood practically rather than scientifically. The snake was food during the worst droughts, not preferred food, not food that anyone chose when something else was available, but food in the sense that the Sertão's people understood that a dead snake represented nutrition that could not be refused. The preparation of snake meat required specific knowledge. Knowledge of which species were venomous, how to handle them safely, and how to process the meat in ways that made it palatable enough to consume. The rattlesnake, called cascavel in Portuguese, is present throughout the Sertão and is large enough to provide significant meat. It was eaten. The knowledge of how to kill a rattlesnake without being bitten, how to skin it, and how to cook the meat in ways that the family could actually consume was practical knowledge in the Sertão in a way that it is practical knowledge almost nowhere else on Earth. The cactus species called mandacaru, one of the most visually distinctive plants of the Sertão landscape, tall, columnar, reaching heights of several meters with multiple branching arms, served a function during drought that was less about its own direct consumption and more about what it could support. Mandacaru flowers and fruits were consumed directly when available. But more importantly, mandacaru was used as a signal plant. Its ability to flower during drought, drawing insects and birds, made it a marker of relative biological activity in a landscape that was otherwise empty, and the concentration of wildlife around flowering mandacaru during drought was something that hunters used systematically. The knowledge of mandacaru flowering patterns and their relationship to animal movement was part of the Sertão's nutritional knowledge system in ways that cross the boundary between plant knowledge and animal knowledge, reflecting the integrated understanding of the landscape that sustained life in the worst conditions. The people who used all of this knowledge, who dug umbuzeiro roots and burned xique-xique spines and harvested termites and chased armadillos across cracked earth and ate rattlesnake meat when it was what was available, were not people without culture, without dignity, without the full range of human feeling about what they were doing and what it cost them. The accounts that exist from the great drought periods, preserved in literature, in oral histories, in the records of travelers and officials who passed through the region, are full of the specific texture of what the experience was. The shame that hunger produces in people who live in a society where feeding your family is one of the basic measures of a person's worth. The way the food available during drought tasted, not just bad, but specifically wrong in ways that were hard to describe. Ways that the body registered as wrong, even when the mind understood that the wrongness was irrelevant to the necessity. The way children reacted to what they were fed, and the way parents managed those reactions, and the way those moments are remembered by the people who experienced them as children and survived to describe them as adults. The knowledge that kept people alive through the great droughts of the Sertão did not come from nowhere. It was built incrementally through the accumulated experience of generations of people living in one of the harshest inhabited landscapes on Earth. It was refined by failure as much as by
secret
success,
is in the slow stirring.
by the knowledge of
isn't
which
just about
approaches did
taste,
not work,
it's how the
which
body
plants were
truly
less useful than
absorbs
they
the energy.
appeared, which animals were not worth the energy cost of pursuing them. It was maintained not in any written record, but in the living memory of communities that understood their continued existence depended on its preservation. And it was applied in the worst moments with a practicality and a determination that is one of the most profound expressions of the human survival instinct that any landscape on Earth has ever produced. The Sertão still exists. The droughts still come. The umbuzeiro still stores its water underground. The xique-xique still grows in dense spine-covered clusters across the scrubland. The armadillo still burrows in the pale soil. And the people who have lived in this landscape for generations still carry, somewhere in their relationship to the land and to each other, the memory of what their ancestors ate when there was nothing left. Not as a curiosity, not as a curie about the distant past, as an inheritance, as the knowledge that made their presence in this landscape possible, that made it survivable, that made it in every sense that matters home.